Hey everyone, I hope you're all doing well. I was recently in New York City for Thanksgiving, and it reminded me of a lot of the reasons that I left New York in the first place and validated them, but it also reminded me of a lot of the things that I miss in New York. For those who don't know, about a year ago on this channel, I put out a video about why I left New York for Seattle. And you should definitely go check out that video. In this one, I'm gonna revisit some of those reasons, reflect on them, see if they came true based on my experiences here in Seattle and having left New York. Do I regret moving? What do I not like about Seattle? What do I miss about New York? Something else to know about me, if you don't, is that I'm a filmmaker. That's most of what I talk about on this channel, in addition to more life videos like this. But it's also to say that I had a lot to lose leaving New York, because outside of LA, New York's probably the best place in the world to be for film. So I think the fact that I'm a filmmaker emphasizes how much of a negative effect the city was having on me. What's funny about Seattle is a lot of people in Seattle will talk to me about how they dream of moving to New York. They fantasize it, they list all the things they hate about Seattle. The things that they often list that they hate about Seattle are all 10 times worse in New York. The theme of this video is that wherever you are, whatever hardships you're dealing with, going to New York is going to make them 10 times harder. And if you're in New York, anywhere you move to, I think is gonna be 10 times easier for you. It's gonna take a huge burden off your shoulder. So in this video, I'm just gonna go over what I think those things are, revisiting some of the reasons I left in the first place, and revisiting how valid I think they are today. So the first thing is cost of living. I'm now living and sharing a 1-bedroom apartment with my girlfriend, and I pay exactly half as much as I did when I lived with 3 roommates in New York City. I looked up just before this video, and the average rent for an apartment in New York City, or I should say in Seattle, not a 1-bedroom, an apartment in general, is $2,300. Contrastingly, the average rent for an apartment in New York City is $4,000. And I even saw some articles that said this summer it got up to $5,000. New York's the only city I can think of where I've met people making 6-figure salaries who live with roommates still. And not like best friends from college, like people they found on Craigslist. This is how much I think it would cost you to live comfortably in New York. And when I say comfortably, I mean taking advantage of all the things that New York's known for, and also what someone would define as being successful in any other ordinary city. So I mean going out to shows, going to the best restaurants, going out to bars, nightlife, buying tables at clubs, or maybe you want to start a family, have 3 kids, right? Send them to the best schools, have your own parking spot, a private parking spot like I do in my apartment now, and not have to deal with alternate side parking. I legitimately think you have to have at least $10 million in the bank to live that comfortable lifestyle in New York, to not deal with the obstacles that the rest of the city has to deal with. And another aspect of making yourself comfortable in New York is avoiding the noise, because like I talked about in my previous video, there's noise everywhere, and it doesn't matter how rich you are, unless you're in that top of the 1%, you're gonna have to deal with the noise in some shape or form. And so that brings me to the next thing, which is construction. It's funny because people in Seattle often complain about how there's too much construction here. And yes, if you come to Seattle and look at the skyline, you'll see cranes everywhere. That said, I don't think I've ever seen someone working on one of those cranes. They're kind of just there. They're like ugly decoration in the city. New York, on the other hand, the way I feel about, I don't even view New York as a city. To me, New York is like one giant construction site with a city functioning around it. Another thing that is really terrible about New York is the traffic. People really also complain in Seattle about the traffic. I've legitimately been in standstill traffic or traffic jams less than 10 times in Seattle. And when I have, that's like an average day in New York City. New York City, driving there is just constant congestion. Now I know what people will say, well, that's why we have the best public transport. And I think people conflate the idea of the best public transport with the only form of transport. Because in New York, most people rely on the subway system, but that doesn't mean that it's good. Just because you have a more expansive subway system than LA doesn't mean your subway system's good. And that's the reality in New York, is that the subways are unreliable. They're the only way to get around aside from taking cabs or having a horrendous life owning a car like I did there. And if the subways get stuck or they're flooded or there's delays, which happens like every day, you're screwed. You either can't get out of the city, you can't get to where you need to go, you'll be late for meetings or you'll miss them. And it's getting even worse nowadays from what I hear, because there's apparently a huge crime uptick in New York. So you're not only dealing with like rodents and trash fires on the subway, now apparently people are pushing each other on the subway and people are getting stabbed all the time. And I have friends who were born and raised in New York City and grew up on the subway, so to speak, who won't even take them anymore. So if the subways are out, you know, you're basically gridlocked in traffic. And so people will complain about the fact that you have to drive in Seattle, but I look at it the other way. I love the fact that I'm able to drive. So that's the big thing to keep in mind with all of these points, not just transportation, is that you're a lot more trapped in New York with what the city provides for you. But in Seattle, yes, you basically have to own a car, but because it's so drivable, the world is a lot more expansive here. That's similar with some of the other issues that the cities share, which is dirtiness. There's trash that piles up on the highways and the freeways. But the thing is, when you're driving, yes, you see it and it's unpleasant to see, but it's different from New York, where you're walking everywhere and the wind is blowing it in your eyes and you feel like you're drowning in it. And in Seattle, it feels more piled up in specific areas, where in New York, it's everywhere. It's littered everywhere. It feels like it's built into the ground, like just like millions of black dots in the concrete. Like you would never want to walk barefoot around New York. Whereas Seattle, you can go to certain parks and go swimming in the lake. Like you wouldn't do that in the Hudson River. Before we move on to some areas that I feel like Seattle and New York compete a little better at, and where maybe I'll be less passionate, let's say. Let's talk about one more thing that people feel like is terrible in Seattle, which I felt was terrible in New York, which is the weather. So I'll say this, when people think of Seattle, they don't think of good weather. And if you have seasonal depression, if gray skies affect you in a negative way, I would say yes, Seattle's probably not the city for you. But for me, it's 1,000 times better than constantly being in a wrestling match with the weather in New York. The snow, the rain, the trash is a form of the elements of its own in New York. The wind is blowing everything in your face. You're always fighting the weather there, which again comes back to the transportation, because in New York you spend so much of the time walking. Yes, it rains a fair amount in Seattle, but can be quite romantic when you're driving or you're sitting in your apartment looking out the window. Even though it rains more days in Seattle, New York still gets more total rainfall year round. So that just means it rains a lot harder in New York. The other thing for me that I love about the weather in Seattle compared to New York is that the bad parts are more mild, but once you get to summer, it's the best summer here. It's almost unbeatable. Whereas in New York, the summer, yes, the city comes alive and everyone's out, but it's disgusting. It's so humid. Even in like 80-degree weather, you're gonna wanna run inside. You do get nice autumns and springs in New York, but the extremes are just too extreme there. So I much prefer the weather in Seattle, and the summer is, you know, my first summer here was such a nice reward for the winter, which, by the way, I kind of like the gloomy weather. It's kind of the vibe of clothing and fashion and music that I surround myself with, so I don't mind it. So now that we've gotten the stuff out of the way where I feel like Seattle beats New York, let's talk about stuff that's a bit more up in the air. A lot of people wanted me to talk about social life, because New York is known for its buzzing social life, whereas Seattle is infamous for something called the Seattle Freeze, where basically people apparently don't talk to each other, especially in the winter. It's hard to make friends here. I feel people in New York are not necessarily nice or mean or one way at all, and I don't think people are like that anywhere really. It's just that different cities do different things to different people. So what New York does to the people living there is it brings out their truest self. It's a very raw city. It's a mirror to your psyche. It puts your hand to the fire. So if you're a nice person in New York, that positivity is gonna show through that hardship. If you are a mean, cranky person, that's really gonna come out and it's gonna bring it out of you. If you seem like a nice person, it might bring out a terrible side that you didn't even know existed. So that's what you're gonna get in New York. So New York's a very mixed bag if you approach people. Whereas in Seattle, I feel that it's the opposite. Instead of the city forcing you to bring your true self out, Seattle, I think, allows you to be a little more comfortable and keep everything in. That said, in my experience in Seattle, going up to people and saying, hey, what's up? How are you? And getting to know them, People are often surprised and flattered. They're not used to it, and they love getting to know you. And I think that's one of the benefits I was referring to when you leave New York. You're prepared for any other city. Things become 10 times easier. Because in New York, you have to be so rough and confrontational. Even if you're an introvert like myself, when you come to Seattle, I find it pretty easy to make friends. I just go up to people. I think a lot of people come here and they're like, why do I have no friends? But they don't put in the real effort it takes to meet people. They don't go up to people themselves. So I feel like if you're proactive, you can meet people in Seattle. And here's the other thing. It's not just about the different types of people that are here. It's about the lifestyles and the activities that are prominent in each city. So in New York, because of the urban planning, because you're limited to what's inside the walls of the city, pretty much, social life surrounds going out, clubbing, bar hopping, things that are going to cost you money. So that divides friendship groups, I think, very socioeconomically. Whereas in Seattle, a lot of the activities revolve not necessarily around the city, not around like Amazon, Starbucks, Microsoft. Sure, people like coffee here, but the nature surrounding it, going hiking, mountain climbing, swimming, paddle boarding, even scuba diving, skiing. So in Seattle, you actually have the opportunity of, if you make, let's say, minimum wage, you work a minimum wage job, you can become really good friends with a guy or girl who is making 6 figures working as a software engineer who owns a townhouse, because you both have this common access to nature. Whereas in New York, that's divided a lot more. And people are always asking you in New York, like, what do you do? People will be friendly, but there's always this subtext of, where's this interaction gonna get me? What can you do for me? What can I do for you? What can we do together? What sort of business can we make together? In Seattle, it's a lot more laid back, a lot more West Coast vibes. There are a lot of flaky people here for sure. You know, I've had people sort of flake on me, but that's just the game of life. You know, it's a numbers game and you got to keep trying. The reason this category to me is a toss-up, because I think it's very subjective. If you want that fast pace, you want to be around people who are constantly hustling, constantly trying to delve into entrepreneurship, New York's definitely the place for you. If you're tired of that, and you're tired of having to spend money to go out and hang out with people, and you just want like laid back experiences, I think Seattle's a much better city. Now, before we talk about the main thing I miss about New York, let's discuss what I don't like about Seattle, and that's 2 main things. One is the drivers. Now, there are terrible drivers everywhere, but there are different driving cultures everywhere. So here's the thing. Seattle, the drivers are horrible. Like a majority of them, I feel like. They're so slow. They stop short. They're not paying attention. They're texting. They're nodding off. They won't go on green lights. You have those sorts of drivers in New York, and I would get pissed at them all the time. Here's the big difference. In New York, when there's someone who is not going on a green light, every single person in line behind them is going to take that moment as a community moment in the day and lay it on their horn and honk at that person. In Seattle, it's frowned upon to honk at people. So because that's so normalized, the shitty driving, you're just dealing with it so much more and all the time. There are no consequences for it. The second thing that I don't like about this city is the very libertarian nature. And what I mean by that is not like necessarily politically, but what I mean is the you do you attitude. We'll just kind of let things play out and see how they unfold. So there are 2 places that relates to. One is when it snows in this city. It snows very rarely, basically once a year, if that. But because it snows so rarely, when it does snow, even just a few inches, the city does absolutely nothing about it and lets the streets freeze over. Everyone takes 2 weeks off work. Everyone takes 2 weeks off school. At least that was my experience my first year here. I don't care what the budget is. You got to do something. People have to be able to get around. I live on a hill and a lot of people live on hills here, and you will slide down the hill if you leave your driveway, so you're just stuck. The other place this relates to of the city not doing anything is the homeless issue. Now, this is a huge American issue right now, but I think it's different in different cities, because in New York you have a ton of homeless people, but you don't have the homeless encampments. And a big difference I noticed is I never saw needles in New York City. The worst thing I saw was a guy smoking a crack pipe on the train once. Here, It happens all the time. My girlfriend goes on the bus. People are smoking crack. People are smoking fentanyl. And I know that there's not a clear answer, but it seems like the city does nothing. In reality, what it leads to is trash piling up, people overdosing, you having to talk about it when your family is visiting you and you go downtown together. It makes life worse for everyone living in the city, including the people in the encampments themselves. So I'm not saying, like, I'm not trying to take a strong stance on the issue, but I'm just saying, like, you can't just leave, you can't just do nothing. And so I feel like the city is too laid back with certain things. And the thing I miss about New York is kind of the opposite of what I don't like in Seattle's laid backness. In New York, there's such a high energy when you go there, even if you're just visiting, and this is why people get a lot of a huge high when visiting, like just touring, you feel this hustle in the air. You feel like everyone has a purpose. When you're walking around New York City, there's this weird combination of feeling anonymous and important. Everyone feels like they're going somewhere, forwarding their lives in some way. And I do miss that energy in a way because I am a very motivated person and I want to surround myself around people who aren't flaky, people who have dreams together and will make things happen. That said, that is a common feeling to feel in New York when you're there for a week, but when you're there for years, it just becomes tiring. You realize that the city is the epitome of hyper-capitalism. As liberal as it is, it's a very dog-eat-dog city, and it ultimately wears you down and makes you feel very alone. So what my advice would be is, if you haven't lived there yet, live there for a year or a few. Or if you do live there, take that mentality, take that hustle, take that energy, and go to another city. And in that other city, you will then be a big fish in a small pond. You will be prepared to take on that city with a mentality that other people there don't have. And you'll probably be happier there and have better quality of life there, be more comfortable, be more relaxed, and it's probably a better place to start a family. So those are my overall thoughts. Let me know what you think in the comments. Happy holidays, everyone.